Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library. Super happy to be here with David Kruh for it is our fifth program together in the last year and a half or so. And if you've been here before, you know that you're going to have an entertaining and educational hour. But before we get to David's presentation on Scollay Square, I'm gonna say it wrong, David. I'm just gonna admit defeat right now. I'm just gonna say it wrong. But before we get to it, I just want to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library who support all of our programming. We couldn't do all this fun stuff without them. And to David for letting us partner with Tewksbury Library for this program. So welcome to all of the patrons from Tewksbury, as well as Ashland, as well as David's fans who join us, program after program. So really, without further ado, I don't think I have any other ado. I'm just going to say that I'm really happy David's here with us again. He was he earned his master's in computer engineering at Boston University. He worked at WRKO Radio. We were talking about that just a few minutes ago. He's done all kinds of stuff, but the important thing for us to know is he's an amazing author that writes great books about local history. And I really love that he comes and speaks about these things to libraries. So David, welcome once again. So happy that you're here.
Thank you very much, Mina, and thank you to the friends, and thank all of you for joining us today here online. Today, we're going to talk about a place. It's ironic that this is Banned Books Week because we're going to be talking about a place where the expression banned in Boston kind of began, and it was a place called Scollay Square. So how did a former New Yorker who was only 6 years old when Scollay Square was torn down find out about this really interesting and classically Boston place? And it all began in 1981 when I had come to Boston to get a job at WRKO Radio. And when I went home for Thanksgiving that year, in attendance was my uncle Al. And Al was a doctor who served in the Navy during World War II. And he was very excited that his nephew had gotten a job in Boston. And he cornered me in one part of the living room and he said to me, "So you're in Boston?" And I could not help but notice that leering smile on his face. He goes, "Tell me, how are things in Scollay Square?" What? I had no idea what he was talking about. And he told me this story, how he says, well, during the war, the ship would pull into port into Charlestown, and the commanding officer would get on the ship's intercom and say, "Okay, men, it's Liberty time in Boston. You've earned it, but just remember the rules. And rule number one is don't go to Scollay Square." So, of course, where was the first place that all those soldiers and sailors went was Scollay Square. So, being a young single man at the time, I couldn't wait to get back to Boston and find this place, which he told me was filled with bars and restaurants and dance halls and nightclubs. And I got to Boston, and this is what I found. Government Center, this collection of city, state, federal, and private office buildings that replaced Scollay Square. This collection of streets, alleyways, and smaller squares, which had all of those wonderful theaters and nightclubs and bars, all of it wiped away in the name of urban renewal in the early 1960s. So I was fascinated by this and began doing some research. There really wasn't a lot written about the square. I found a small pamphlet at the old State House. There's one picture I found. This is looking into Scollay Square in 1860. And I want you to focus on that 5-story building over in the center of our photo, because here is the same exact view about 120 years later after renewal. So it's no wonder that I was so confused about where was this place called Scollay Square, because it had been completely wiped off the map. So Scollay Square, why did it become this nexus of all of this activity? Well, it turns out that if you were coming from Cambridge across the Boston Bridge and you were heading into downtown, or if you were coming from the North End and wanted to go down Boston's Neck to the mainland, or if you were coming from Long Wharf and wanted to get to the North End or over to Cambridge, you had to cross through this intersection of Court, Cornhill, Cambridge streets here at the base of Beacon Hill. This is where William Vassall built a marvelous, beautiful mansion at the base of Beacon Hill. Now, in 1871, just across the street from the William Vassall Gardner Green home was built this building, and it was owned by a fellow named William Scollay. That's Scollay. And Mina, don't fret. I had trouble figuring out with my latent New York Queens accent how to pronounce it. It is the Scottish Scollay. And there was, at the time, horse-drawn carriages and public transportation were actually private companies bringing people in through these horse-drawn trolleys. There was no MBTA, no one to say, this is the particular name of this place. So they would use the name of this building. William Scollay, the builder of this building, named it after himself. So this was the Scollay building, and the trolley operators, the taxi drivers, they would say, okay, here's Scollay's building. Eventually, people in Boston began to call this place Scollay Square, then simply Scollay Square. And by 1838, that became the official designation for this part of Boston. The William Vassall home was beautiful, but the developers saw, with the increasing population in Boston, an opportunity to build this magnificent row of stone buildings together known as Tremont Row. Tremont Row is where America first learned, first of all, I'm sorry, is where one of Boston's first daguerreotypists were located. Now, daguerreotyping is a fancy 19th century word for photographers. They were usually located in the upper floors of a building because in order to take a picture, they needed lots of light. The way the plates were back then, the chemistry of them needed lots of light. So they would literally have to open up the top of their building to let enough light in so they could capture their subject. Underneath where these two daguerreotypists were located was the Papanti Dance Studio. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is where America first learned to dance the waltz. Also, along a section of Tremont Row were two dentists by the names of Wells and Morton. They advertised, as you can see in this ad from the Boston Post, that all operations performed under their new improved method. Were I live in front of you, I would say, how many people know what that new improved method was? I can see some of you raising your hand. Ooh, I know. Of course, it was the use of ether in the practice of dentistry, and they were among the first to use ether. And we are now looking from the studios of those daguerreotypists as we look at the back of the Scollay building towards the Sears Crescent building, which you can see over on the right side of our building. If we were go down this street, this is Cambridge Street, off to our left, that would be State Street, and off to our right, that would be Tremont. In 1871, Boston tore down the very old and at that point very decrepit Scollay building because, well, some big things were happening in Boston. We have to go back to the 1840s and the Great Potato Famine and the waves and waves and more waves of Irish immigrants who came to many American cities, among them Boston. They settled in the North End, they settled in the West End and the Fort Hill section. And all those Brahmins and blue bloods who had been going to the Papanti Dance Studio, well, they didn't take too well to these Irish immigrants making their way into their territory. So as the Back Bay in Boston is being built, the Brahmins, the Blue Bloods, they kind of moved up Beacon Hill and slowly down into the Back Bay, leaving this section of Boston open for the type of development, the type of patronage that store owners would expect. So no longer did you have fancy restaurants with porcelain dishes and beautiful special foods. You had cafeterias. You had the SS Pierce building. You can see the horse-drawn carriages and the conveyances bringing dry goods and other products into an area which the immigrants, first the Irish, and then the Italians, and then the Eastern European Jews. And as this area became more mixed, it became even more vibrant. We're going to talk about the building of the subway. Boston was the first American city to have a subway. It was finished in 1897. It was extended here into Scollay Square in 1898. And you can see it is just a beautiful mass of urban confusion. I love this photo and all these cars and people. One problem they were having was that people could not be seen stepping out from this beautiful old kiosk. A lot of car accidents were happening, pedestrians were getting hit, and so in the late 1920s, the city made the decision to eliminate those beautiful old kiosks. At that point, they were only about 30 years old, and replace them with these very simple holes in the ground. But boy, oh boy, it gives us the opportunity to have this beautiful view. This is Tremont Row, the Papanti Dance Studio, and the fancy daguerreotypists. And now what do you have? You have chiropodists and lunch counters and photo studios for the sailors on leave, bowling alleys, and of course, theaters. And we're going to talk about all of that. Scollay Square became the center of military activity during World War II. It's where the sailors, including the men who served with my uncle, where the soldiers went, where high school truants, where businessmen, of everybody came here to Scollay Square to sample all that it had to offer. But something happened to Boston after World War II. We're going to dive into that a bit as well. As the soldiers and the sailors and the Marines and the pilots and the WACs and the waves came back and began taking advantage of the vibrancy, the economic growth after World War II, the GI Bill, they began to move out of the city, and Boston began to fall into disrepair. So much so that by 1962, the once vibrant Scollay Square, well, as we sweep our way from right to left, let's see, we have a bar and another bar, and there's the Liberty Tattoo Shop, there's an abandoned theater, a couple of more bars. It basically was a rundown area, and something needed to be done. What they did was they wiped it all out and they replaced it with Government Center. So in the first 10 minutes, I've basically taken you about 350, 375 years from start to finish. Now let's dive into a couple of really interesting side stories. So we talked about Scollay Square becoming this vibrant commercial center. One of the tricks is maybe not the right word. One of the clues that historians look for when you try to understand the way people felt about an area at that time. You know, we look at Scollay Square, those of us old enough to remember, or who have parents or grandparents who give you that same leer that my uncle did. Remember, Scollay Square is this very bawdy place. But you know what? In 1898, when it was, I'm sorry, in 1880, when it was time to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of Boston, where do we put a statue of John Winthrop, the guy who founded Boston? They put it here in the middle of Scollay Square. And there's a clue which tells you how people felt about this part of town. In fact, some of the old guidebooks that I've collected over the years, one of them, you open it up and it says, if you want an example of Yankee entrepreneurship, of American entrepreneurship in America, you go to Scollay Square, and because that's where all of this commercial activity was happening. And that's all well and good until that aforementioned subway had to be built. So this is why they needed to build a subway. There were so many trolleys running on the surface of Boston streets. It could take you an hour to go down one block down Tremont Street. And for those of us who remember the elevated artery, it sounds familiar. But over there on the right side, there's our good friend, Governor John Winthrop, and he's kind of being crowded by all of these trolleys. And look just over his right arm, and you'll see construction is happening underground for the extension of that subway here into Scollay Square. It's a really cool picture. Here's the completed Scollay Square station. It's a beautiful piece of architecture. Even the clocks worked. And so when I said that I didn't know Scollay Square when I heard the story from my uncle, I meant it. But when I saw this picture in the MBTA archives, I suddenly did remember that I had heard of Scollay Square. When I was at summer camp, the camp counselors dragged out a guitar and around the campfire started singing a song that became a hit by a group called the Kingston Trio. And everybody probably knows the song, and you're humming it right now, aren't you? It's about that guy named Charlie whose wife goes down to the Scollay Square station every day at 2:15, and through the open window she hands Charlie a sandwich as the train goes rumbling through. And if you're really paying attention as today's Green Line goes in and out of the Government Center stop, you will see a couple of remnants of the original Scollay Square station. Well, again, a beautiful, beautiful piece of architecture right here, smack dab in the middle of the intersection of Tremont State and Cambridge. But what do you do with this statue of John Winthrop? And what they did, temporarily at least, was, if you notice, they've moved him. They've literally picked up that pedestal and they moved it down State Street by about 25 feet. And that was all well and good until about 1905. He was only there for maybe 5 or 6 years. And that's when they built what we today call the Blue Line. Back then, they called it the East Boston Line. And they needed another exit kiosk. So they had to remove John Winthrop because they needed to put the exit kiosk right there in the center of the street. So they finally got wise and took John Winthrop and they put him here in front of the first and second churches at the intersection of Marlborough and Berkeley in the Back Bay. John Winthrop was also a minister in the First Church of Boston, so this is a completely appropriate place for him to be. So, folks, if you ever want to see an actual piece, a remnant of Scollay Square, he's still standing there in front of the First Church of Boston. Meanwhile, strange things were happening here in Scollay Square. In 1919, several members of the Boston Police Department tried to form a branch of the AFL. Now, the police chief, a guy named Charles Curtis, declared that no man can serve two masters. And this was also post-World War I, Red Scare. The commies are hiding behind every tree, America. And the last thing they wanted was a union here in the police department. So he fires the guys trying to form a union, and almost all members of the Boston Police Department walk out. They strike on September 9th, 1919. This amazing photograph was taken on the afternoon of September 10th, 1919. We see tens of thousands of people milling about here in Scollay Square. Now, why Scollay Square? Because this was the center of, well, let's see. If we go to the left, there's the courthouse. Behind the courthouse is Boston City Hall. To our right, if we go up into Pemberton Square, located behind Tremont Row, that's where the Boston Police Department had its headquarters. And if we go further up the hill, we end up at the State House, where a guy named Calvin Coolidge was governor. And he declared there is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, at any time. And boy, he meant it. He actually sent the cavalry. He sent men on horseback charging into Scollay Square. I highly recommend, if you're interested in the details, a great book by Francis Russell called City in Terror. And he describes in detail the amazing events of the week that the Boston police went on strike. I love this photo. I was giving this talk in Dedham, and when the talk was over, because I mentioned that the Massachusetts militia took over the policing duties here in Boston until an entirely new police force could be put together. And when the speech was over, this elderly woman came up to me and she said, "I just wanted to thank you for showing everybody what my daddy did during the police strike." Isn't that cool? Okay, this happy-looking fellow is William Miller. He was a reverend, and he was also a mathematically precise fellow. And he had studied his book of Revelation. That's the one about the end of days. And from it, he had mathematically concluded that the second coming would occur on April 24th, 1844. And he convinced an awful lot of people of this fact, and they gathered in this wooden tabernacle they built down on Howard Street. And there they prayed every night for a year, waiting for that moment when the believers would be taken up to heaven and those who had not accepted would be cast down to hell. And of course, in April of 1844, nothing happened. So the good reverend went back to his revelation, recalculated. He actually tried to get the parishioners to believe that, I don't know, he had failed to carry the 2 or something like that. And they were having none of it. They sent Miller back to Vermont from whence he came, and perhaps to recoup some of the financial losses, if not their dignity, they rented out this tabernacle to a couple of entrepreneurs, 2 fellows named Boyd and Beard, who said this would be a splendid place for an Athenaeum. Now, an Athenaeum is a fancy 18th, 19th century word for theater. And here on October 6th of 1845, we see the very, look at this, we're almost at an actual anniversary. Yesterday was the anniversary of the first presentation at the Howard Athenaeum of the drawing room comedy, The Rivals. The theater did great box office and everything was going great until January of 1846. They were showing this play called The Piazzaro. And it climaxes with this marvelous special effect. This fireball would come down from the rafters, explode on the stage in a big ball of flame. Great special effect, only it burned the theater down. So Boyd and Beard knew they had a tiger by the tail, and they had the theater rebuilt in Quincy granite. And this theater became even more popular than ever. William Macready, an entire family of Shakespearean actors named Booth, including John Wilkes Booth, who performed Hamlet here. The theater became one of the most popular and attractions in Boston, and the citizenry was just elated. They loved this theater. But it's interesting to note that Mr. Boyd and Mr. Beer were never quite certain that the Howard Athenaeum would take off, because on the first floor of their theater, they built a brewery. So we talked about the evolution of Boston with the coming of the Irish and the Italians and other ethnic groups. By 1868, after the Civil War, the people of Boston, mostly those Brahmins and those blue bloods, were now so far up Beacon Hill, so far down into the Back Bay, they were not coming to the Howard Athenaeum to see William Macready, to hear Shakespeare, to watch ballet. So the new managers of the Howard decided to go popular with what was known as variety. Look at this: minstrel shows, gymnastics, pantomime, and seats in the gallery, only 15 cents. And this entertainment allowed the Howard to become even more popular. Now, variety slowly evolved into something called burlesque. But hold on, folks, this is not the bump and grind, and Corio, Sally Rand type of burlesque. This was burlesque as it was performed in the 1870s and 1880s. It was to burlesque up, to vamp up. So you might have Antigone, you might have Hamlet, but it was with Irish accents or Italian accents. And there was always a little slapstick involved. There was also, as you can see, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and attractions like Strong Women, who performed here at the Howard Athenaeum. A man named Tony Pastor in New York, he created a new type of entertainment called vaudeville. And it was Weber and Fields, it was Fanny Brice, it was the Marx Brothers, it was George Burns and Gracie Allen. And of course, the owners of the Howard Athenaeum had to bring vaudeville to the people of Boston. It is interesting to note, it's amusing to note, the Howard had become so popular with this variety and this burlesque and then vaudeville that people began to call it the Old Howard. Heck, the place was only 40 years old in the 1880s, but they called it the Old Howard and they grabbed onto that name. But it's nice to know that even the Brahmins and the Blue Bloods, like the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was reported to have said while seated here at the Old Howard after a vaudevillian delivered a particularly spicy punchline, you know, thank God I am a man of low taste. Well, burlesque, vaudeville did great, but then two things got invented that killed vaudeville. One was radio and the other was motion pictures. And between the two of them, the box office at the Old Howard and every burlesque, every theater around the country that was showing vaudeville began to wane. And that's when this form of burlesque began. This is, we're seeing on the left side of our screen, a guy named Phil Silvers, who had cut his teeth as a burlesquer at the Old Howard. Up in the upper right-hand corner, that's Ann Corio, one of the most famous and popular dancers. You can see the intimacy of this theater in these two rare pictures inside the Old Howard. But it's interesting for me to note, because when people ask about Scollay Square, they try to equivocate it with the combat zone. And nothing could be further from the truth. Look at the people lining up to buy tickets at the Old Howard. To me, it looks like they're the women in in beautiful evening gowns, the men wearing ties. They look like they're going to buy tickets to a performance of Oklahoma, not Ann Corio. Speaking of Corio, here's a copy of a program from the Howard, which includes an ad for a place called Joe and Nemo's. Now, anybody who was old enough to remember the old Howard would probably tell you that this kind of advertising was unnecessary. It was pretty much de rigueur that if you went to the old Howard, you had to go to Joe and Nemo's for a hot dog. The apocryphal story is of the man who comes home one night after being in Boston, and his wife takes one look at him and says, "You went to the old Howard. I told you not to go." He says, "I did not go to the old Howard." She says, "Yes, you did, and I can prove it." He goes, "How do you prove it?" He goes, "She said, you got mustard on your tie, which means you had a hot dog, which means you were at Joe and Nemo's." Joe and Nemo's so popular. I love just going through old newspapers, and I find this picture from the Boston Post. It is from the middle of World War II. We are at Pearl Harbor, and these 8 boys from the Boston area were so homesick that they named their thatch wreck hut Joe and Nemo. There were so many theaters. This is called the Museum and Gallery of Fine Arts, which is located here on Tremont Street. Look at the interior of this theater, keeping in the tune of the Athenaeums, which pretended to be sophisticated and highbrow. Look at the Corinthian columns, all the statuary, these sorts of places where you might see um, a wax recreation of the Last Supper, or you might see um, acts that were more likely to be seen at a carnival sideshow or what they used to call freak shows. That's what you got to see for a dime at places like Moses Kimball's or here at Austin and Stone's Museum. Slowly, things began to change again with the beginning of motion pictures. These live theaters would be converted into places to show motion pictures. We can see the Star Theater eventually became the Rialto, which sadly during the Depression became something of a de facto boarding house. Next door was Scully's Olympia. For you architectural historians, it's one of the first buildings in Boston to use steel reinforced concrete. In fact, it is a twin of a building that was in the combat zone, which housed the Pilgrim Theater. Oops. I spent my career, most of it, in marketing. I love this example of how they marketed the motion picture and live stage show. The Rhythm of Flame Girls, who would appear before the movie Too Much Harmony. And you can see that all these young men obviously cannot wait to see that upcoming Bing Crosby picture. Over in Bowdoin Square, another small little theater, I spoke to one person who remembers the amateur shows and actually seeing a hook come out and actually drag some poor performer off the stage. Here's the Theater Comique, one of the first motion picture houses built expressly for showing motion pictures. And look at that, only 10 cents to see this latest fantastic new technology. This is the Palace Theater, which I'm not showing you because it's a theater, but because of what happened up in that attic. And this is one of those just happenstance things that while I was researching the fun part of Scollay Square, I find out this, holy cow, this thing actually happened here. Like in 1868, a young man named Thomas Edison coming here to Boston, getting a job at the Western Union office because he was a very skilled telegrapher, and then renting space up at the top floor of this building where Charles Williams, who owned this building, was renting out space to young inventors, young entrepreneurs. And this is where Edison invented his first patented invention, which was an automatic vote counter, and where he worked on something called the multiple telegraph, because everything was done by single wire telegraphy. Boy, if you could figure out how to send more than one signal over every single wire, you would automatically triple, double, maybe even by a dozen times increase the ability to send more messages, which means, of course, more money. Edison finally built a stock ticker to which he lost all his rights, and that's when he left Boston, about as poor as when he arrived. Folks, what I found was exactly 5 years after Edison left and then became a success in New York, a professor of the deaf from Boston University, also trying to figure out how to build that multiple telegraph, came up with the idea for what would eventually be the telephone. In fact, it was up there in that attic, in the same place where Thomas Edison invented his first three inventions, that the telephone, when we first heard the sound of the human voice through an electronic device. And if you go today to Boston City Hall Plaza, you will see a stone marker which indicates this is the place where the telephone was invented. I've asked why we can't add a little thing that says, oh, and by the way, Thomas Edison was here, but nobody wants to listen. So we move on. All right. Some of the streets that lead into Scollay Square have their own really interesting history, such as Cornhill, which is rumored to be a place where slaves who were making their way to Canada as part of the Underground Railroad would actually be hidden in the basements of some of these buildings. In the 20th century, Cornhill evolved into the place to go for used books and for magazines. Over on the next street, this is Brattle Street. Here is the Brattle Square Church. Now, when Boston went under siege, the British would use buildings. They take, by the way, they would literally, because it's cold in Boston, and 1775 was a particularly cold winter, they would tear down churches and use the firewood. Luckily, the Brattle Square Church had been rebuilt a few years earlier in stone. So the commander of the British troops used the church. He cleared out the pews, which I think they burned, and they used the inside as a little riding academy. So the Americans up at Lechmere Point, they were fond of firing shells into British positions. One of them struck the church, and it's adorable because the parishioners here thought it was a source of great pride that somehow their church had become a part of Revolutionary War history, and they preserved that, but actually stuck it back in the wall of the church and made it a great point to show everybody their role in the revolution. At the head of Brattle Street here on Cambridge Street was a hotel. The Brattle Square, the Brattle, suddenly I'm blanking on the name. I'll have to look it up. Oh my God. This hotel was originally one of America's finest hotels. This is where many politicians stayed. There were, matter of fact, many of the hotels like the American House in Young's Hotel and the Revere House over in Bowdoin Square, they housed presidents and princes and czars. And this hotel became another one of the more popular hotels, especially with all the restaurants that were located inside. In the 1920s, because of prohibition, people stopped going out to dinner, and nightclub owners needed something, some draw to bring people into their restaurants. And so they began having dancers and singers and musicians. And here at the here at the Crawford House, gosh, David, come on. This is the Crawford House. And here at the Crawford House, Frank Fontaine, who was a local boy, Larry Storch, and allegedly Don Rickles are among the hundreds of performers who went on to movies and to television, but who cut their teeth playing here at the Crawford House nightclub. But of course, nobody who performed here had as big an impact as this woman, Sally Keith. She was Queen of the Tassels, spelled incorrectly here, but hey, who cares? Sally Keith's act consisted of two tassels, one hung delicately from each breast. As the music began to play, she would twitch her body and make the tassels twirl in opposite directions. And just when you thought the music couldn't go any faster and the tassels couldn't move any faster, she would turn around and she had two other tassels, one on each cheek. They were also spinning in opposite directions. It is said that the old joke is, and it may be true, it's apocryphal, but on the mornings after Sally Keith performed, chiropractors all over the Boston area saw an influx of women who had thrown out their backs trying to do the tassel number. Sally Keith, originally, by the way, Sally Katz, a nice Jewish girl from Chicago. I've gotten to know her niece, who corrected one rumor that kept going around Boston for years. Sally's father was a house painter. He was not a policeman. Okay. Now, let's go back to that whole thing about what happened to Boston and what happened to Scollay Square after the war. It's November 1945. America has won, and now we're having a parade. And maybe you recognize the guy we're celebrating. That's Ike Eisenhower, General Eisenhower. He's being celebrated by happy Bostonians. And I, for one, think it's only appropriate that after all those soldiers and sailors under his command, that their commander-in-chief finally make his way here into Scollay Square. I highly doubt, though, he had time to stop in at the Rialto or get a hot dog at Joe and Nemo's. Okay, all of our soldiers and sailors, they come back. America's economy is roaring, and people are leaving Boston. We also, in 1945, re-elected James Michael Curley. And he and his cronies proceeded to go back to ravaging the city's coffers. And so the city fell into disrepair. So something fun happened in 1947. You see, James Michael Curley had a little legal problem. Had something to do with well, he ended up in federal prison at Danbury. And I don't have the picture, but there's a great picture of him being led where he's going to serve his time at Danbury. He went and he got clothes, shirts and jackets that were 2 sizes too big. So he would look like this poor emaciated old man as they dragged him off to prison, excuse me. And while he was in prison, that man way over on the right side of our picture, he was Johnny Hines, and he was the president of the Boston City Council. And as per the rules of the time, he became acting mayor. And this is a great picture taken at the Holy Name Society in 1947. It's, of course, the Cardinal. You got your Leverett Saltonstall, Henry Cabot Lodge, Robert Bradford, Yankees all, shaking the hand of the Cardinal, and there's Johnny Hines. So Curley gets out of Danbury. Truman commuted his sentence. And he stands in front of the reporters and he says, I did more in 1 week than Johnny Hines did in 5 months. And Johnny Hines kind of took that personally. And so in 1949, he ran against his old boss and he won. And he began utilizing some of the federal programs, the Urban Renewal Act, the Highway Act, to bring in money. Sadly, of course, his greatest error, the one that tragically still resonates today, was the taking of the West End. But Boston had gotten renewal fever, and so when John Collins, the man to our right, when he came into office, he hired a city planner by the name of Ed Logue, and together they worked to develop a plan to replace Scollay Square with Government Center. And in 1961, demolition began on buildings, some of which were about 150 years old. Now, there were plans afoot to tear down the old Howard, but a bunch of citizens got together, among them some Harvard professors, among them some vaudeville and burlesque performers, to try to save the old Howard, turn it into like what the Ford's Theater is and other theaters in New York, where it could be preserved and used as a cultural center. But it was not to be. In June of 1961, a fire of, quote, mysterious origin, and I use the word, I'm doing the air quote thing now because I have a copy of the fire department report. They say it was mysterious origin. Some people claim it was arson. I've spoken to some people who remember that the wrecking ball, the tractors hooked, the wrecking ball hooked up to the crane. Those crane operations were actually idling, waiting for the firemen to finish their job so they could come in and tear down the old Howard. It's a great publicity shot that Ann Corio took. She was actually, she claimed that the fire ate through all of the posters that had been pasted on top of her poster for a show known as Girls in Blue. This was a show that she used to create her own traveling performance, which she later claimed was ripped off by the people who did Sugar Babies. And then, tragically, this is another rare picture inside the old Howard, and it shows the damage and how difficult it would have been to even keep the structure going. So block by block, building by building, they would tear down old Scollay Square. There's Jack's Joke Shop, which when it opened in 1922 was said to be America's first joke shop. I love that. I love that in America, this was the first town where you could buy a whoopee cushion. The Casino Theater, which was a companion, and interestingly enough, when the Howard was closed by the city in 1953, two men from the Vice Squad snuck into the old Howard in November of 1953. One of them had a 16mm camera hidden under his raincoat. I know I could make a lot of jokes there, but I'm not going to. The point is, he filmed a dancer by the name of Mary Goodneighbor, who the audience knew as Irma the Body, performing how she got her name. And they brought it to a guy named Judge Elijah Adlow, and he declared that the performance was obscene, and they closed the theater. Well, by this point, as you can see, Boston is falling into disrepair. There wasn't a lot of box office at the Howard anyway. So the old Howard owners bought the license at the casino and transferred the name. So then the casino became known as the Old Howard Casino. So you may talk to people who remember going to the Old Howard in 1958, 1959, even as late as 1961. No, they didn't. They went to the casino, which just happened to have the name. You can see Tremont Row, which was on our left side, is completely gone. On the right side, the place where City Hall Plaza would be is slowly being removed. This is 123 Central Plaza, which really is three separate buildings. In fact, during construction, the Beacon Construction Company very cleverly wrote the words "to be continued" at the end of each one of the buildings. So They swept away everything that we've been talking about for the past hour. Scollay Square is gone, replaced by City Hall. Now, look, I'm going to cut you off because I know what you're thinking. This building was the result of a nationwide competition. Folks, I've seen the runners up. This is actually a dynamic, forward-thinking building. It was, and I'm putting on my historian's cap now, considering that Boston was described by one national magazine as, quote, dying on the vine. It was a necessary thing to make this declaration that Boston was going to go big and it was going to go bold. Of course, Edward Durrell Stone, who was an architectural critic, he said to me, it looks like the crate that Faneuil Hall came in. But there's no question that between this and the Prudential Project and other urban renewal projects, Boston slowly brought itself back from the brink. There was a novel written about Scollay Square by a Beacon Hill native by the name of Pearl Schiff. God bless her. Her book made it to the New York Times bestseller list. There are other remnants of Scollay Square you can still find today. If you go in behind One Center Plaza to that stone bench, you'll see a plaque that was placed there by some devotees of the theater, which indicate the exact spot of the center of the stage of the old Howard. In 1986, radio host Jerry Williams was broadcasting after a Boston Celtics World Championship celebration. He was broadcasting from City Hall Plaza, but he said, "This is Jerry Williams, and I'm broadcasting not from Government Center, but from Scollay Square. Let's bring back Scollay Square." And it's thanks to Jerry. A year later, then Mayor Ray Flynn read the proclamation, which turned this part of Boston back to Scollay Square, at least in name only. Sadly, those Scollay Square street signs are gone. They've rebuilt the subway station, but if you go down into the Blue Line, you will see some of the original tile work from the original East Boston Line extension that was built under the Green Line back in 1912. City Hall Plaza has undergone another rejuvenation. This is after years of proposals. One person even suggested building a replica of Fenway Park, but none of that ever happened. But City Hall Plaza is slightly more vibrant today, but at 5 o'clock, with all the government buildings around and all the private offices, especially after the pandemic, it's still pretty dead after 5 o'clock, and there doesn't seem to be much you can do about that. Neither of these books made it to the New York Times bestseller list, and both are out of print, but I'm sure if you check your Amazon and check your other used book dealers, they might be able to get it. If you want more, and I encourage you, they're here at joeandnemo.com. If you've got a phone, you just do the QR code thing here. I've got pictures, I've got movies, I've got audio, I've got more stories than I could fit into this hour presentation. Folks, I so appreciate everybody coming here and taking the time to join us for this presentation. Mina, I'm going to turn it over to you, and if we have any questions or you want to do something with the chat thing, again, thank you all so very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, David. Of course, it was amazing, and I've learned a lot. I was wondering if you want to turn your share screen off, and we can go through some chat and questions.
Sure.
If people in the audience, if you have questions, just put them in the Q&A, and I'll read
Okay.
them out to David since
All
we're
righty,
in
I'm
webinar
gonna
mode.
turn this off, folks, but it's joeandnemo.com. There we go. Hello.
Hello. That was a fun hour. I
Thank
do
you.
have a question about
Sure.
you actually, David. You write so many stories like have so many presentations about things going on in Boston. What drew you to this story?
Well, it was my uncle telling me that first Scollay Square story. And coming back to Boston, I was government, RKO was located in Government Center. So I had a lot of time during lunch breaks and dinner breaks to kind of walk around. And there was, I still remember this so vividly. I'm walking around, I'm looking at the map. It's got those great tourist maps. And I actually stopped some guy and I said, "Excuse me, can you tell me how to get to Scollay Square?" And the bemused look on his face, and he just looked at me and says, "Kid, you're 20 years too late." And that's when I went down to the old State House and I found this. I could probably get my hands on it. It's a tiny little pamphlet by
Mhm.
Walter Muir Whitehill called The Metamorphosis of Bowdoin and Scollay Square. So there were maybe like 7 pages on Scollay Square. And I just started asking and talking to people. And I started hearing the Ann Corio and the Sally Rand and the Sally Keith and the tattoos and I said, "My God." And then I would go to the Boston Public Library and see, "Oh, look at that. George Washington actually slept here.
Mhm.
Oh, Thomas Edison. Oh." So the idea began to form in my mind about writing a book since no one else was doing it. I couldn't figure out why wasn't a native writing a book about it? And the answer is, Scully, it's like, why would someone write a book about the combat zone? Which, by the way, Stephanie Shuro did, and it's killer. It's a really good book. So
Mhm.
if you're looking for the bookends of the two types of places that Boston went, you know, Scollay Square and then the combat zone.
Mhm.
Stephanie.
Yeah, I always think it's interesting where people get their ideas. I know you said that your uncle made that comment, but then you went digging for it, which is just fascinating.
Yeah.
Um, Lots of comments about how much people are enjoying this
Oh,
and bringing back memories. John says, I first became aware of Scollay Square's former existence when I read that Babe Ruth had frequented the place while a member of the Red Sox. Was this like when it was a little bit risque? That's my question. His was just about the Babe Ruth.
well, I trust that you wouldn't be shocked that Babe Ruth did something risque. I mean, he's a, um, well, I'll tell you, Ted Williams used to come there, but he went there for fishing gear at Ivor Johnson's, I
Fishing
think was
gear.
the name of the place. No, no, he really did. He was a master. He was a world-class fly fisherman, and
Mhm.
Ivor Johnson's had some of the best gear around. So yes, um, look, here's the difference between Scollay Square and what came in the 70s and 80s and with the golden banana up there and this and the combat zone. I talk about in the book. I say Scollay Square and those entertainments were like radio. You didn't actually see anything. There was teasing, but and there was a quick blackout, and maybe you saw something, but it was radio. You had to imagine what you saw. It was all in your mind. Not so anything that followed. It was TV. It was right there, and it became less artistic, with all due respect to the performers of that next era, a little cruder. There wasn't as much audience involvement up here. So that to me is the difference. So sure, did Babe go there? Probably. So did every businessman. Willie Loman when he came to Boston, right? He probably went to Scollay Square. Whenever I see Death of a Salesman and I see that scene in the hotel room, I imagine that's got to be Scollay Square.
Well, I mean, definitely sounds infamous for the time,
Oh
that
yeah,
was there. But
yeah.
I'm sure there was more there than just the burlesque and,
Well,
Mary.
there were restaurants. There was
Mhm.
Kelly and Hayes Gym. My wife's uncle John was a boxer. We've got a great picture of him that was taken at Kelly and Hayes. Um, there was the first Radio Shack.
Mhm. Oh.
There were, so yes, of course, there were dentists and there were bowling alleys and there was just lots of stuff to do.
Mhm. Mary says, when did the joke shop get pulled down?
1962, they moved to over by the theater district. and they were there for years. In fact, when I was writing the book, I went over and I interviewed a couple of the guys who were there back in the original spot. And by the way, I can also use this opportunity to say none of the theaters, none of the theaters, none of the bawdy stuff went from Scollay Square to the combat zone. The only business of which I am aware that moved and survived was there was the Brattle Bookstore, which is still on West Street, and there was Jack's Joke Shop. And they're the ones that moved, I think, to the end of Tremont Street, just outside the theater zone.
I think Kathleen wants to fight you that happened in the late 50s, not 60s.
What happened late? Yes,
The joke shop.
The Joke Shop. Yes, late. No, it was 62 because Tremont Row had all those buildings had been torn down by 62.
Okay, well, I'll take your word for it then, because you're the expert.
No, I mean, email me if you've got something that says otherwise, because I'm always up for learning new stuff.
All right, Kathleen, challenge on. Scott,
late 50s. Oh yeah, right. Yes, Kathleen, late 60s, late 50s, not six. Well, yeah, they might have moved. The building itself was there until 61.
Okay. So Scott just asked if you could remind him which church the Winthrop statue is at now.
The First and Second Church of Boston at the intersection of Marlborough and Berkeley.
Okay. That is in the recording. You can check it out later if you didn't catch it. Joan says that Death of the Salesman scene was at the Parker House.
Really? Is that because I have a copy? I have one of the few copies I have of. Is it in the actual notes? I mean, the interesting. Okay. Well, I'm still gonna think. Well, it's close enough, right? Parker House, just down Tremont Street.
Exactly.
It seems so seedy, though, doesn't it? It seems
does.
too seedy to be the Parker House. Okay.
Okay.
Hold on.
Oh,
I got my copy. I'm seriously. I'm gonna look that up.
I love it. Researcher.
Beautiful piece of writing, by the way. One of the great American plays. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm
it's
just
okay.
getting distracted.
That's okay. I have one last question for you.
Yeah.
And this has to do not with Scollay Square, but the government center. You said it was like very much like it had gone to lots of people, RFPs, things like that. Why the concrete though? Like, why is it? What was
the vision? First of all, in 1968, when City Hall opened, it was there was a fountain in the middle, and the fountain actually worked, but it didn't work for very long because they forgot that this is New England and there's snow and ice. The vision was to create Boston's version of St. Peter's Square, of some of those beautiful. Anyone who's been to Italy and you see those beautiful piazzas with the fountains. The problem is, as Campbell, the great architectural critic who used to write for the Globe, is you can't just build it and say, now this is this thing. It's like Newbury Street evolved, Hanover Street evolved. You can't just put a street down, put up some buildings that look old, and say, well, now this is the shopping district. No, things have to evolve. They have to, and so they built this plaza. They brick it over. There's like 1 million bricks on that plaza, and you can't just say, okay, everybody, now you've got your own, piazza. But it doesn't work like that. People have to feel it. They have to experience it and make it their own, not be told. And that was one of the main problems with it. Plus, why go there? Where's the place where I can get a fresh piece of pastry or buy some clothing? There's nothing there except City Hall, JFK, a bunch of office buildings. And that was the biggest mistake they made. They cut Hanover Street off down at Congress. It used to go all the way up to the base of Beacon Hill. But they said, no cars. We want people. And without cars, there's no reason, and there's no commerce.
Yeah, I used to work at Historic New England, right there. There's a
Hmm.
and I loved going just around that area. It was lively, I'll say. But it sort of reminds me of, like, Rome or whatever, where there's like this layer of like ancient Rome and then, current Rome. And Boston's like that, except they actually did away with all of Scollay Square.
Yeah, well, and that's yeah, yeah.
Isn't that
There's not
bizarre?
a
Like
lot.
it eventually would have just been there, like underneath. I'm just kidding. That's
No,
fine.
no. See, what a lot of people don't know is that, like, look at the North End. Okay, the North End. If if the urban renewal demolition types had their way for a few more years, the North End would be just like the West End.
Mm,
Glass and steel buildings. There wouldn't be any of that, those wonderful restaurants and the culture, and because that was the thinking back then. And unfortunately, the West End almost had to go in order for us to realize, oh God, look what we've done. What a tragedy this was. And that got us to rethinking also the New York streets debacle down in the South End. There were so many little neighborhoods. There was a neighborhood in the Alston section that was also just these people with a flick of a switch, they bulldozed the neighborhood because they needed to build an off ramp, or they decided that, oh, that's old. Who wants that? Well, now we know. Look at Beacon Hill. Look at the North End. Look at the South End.
mhm,
I mean, those are wonderful walkable neighborhoods because we took the time to refurbish them, to build them back up, to gentrify them and make them more vibrant. Please
mhm.
don't touch the North End. Of course, Cheryl. No,
No,
no
we're keep
touching.
no touchy touchy.
Please.
All right. Well, David, thank you so much for
No,
another
thank you
wonderful,
so much,
wonderful
everybody.
talk. Yeah, and for people here or still here, I'm going to be chatting with David about bringing us talk about the Ponzi scheme
Oh yeah.
to Ashland
Bring
and the
your
truants.
checkbooks.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, don't bring your checkbooks.
No, don't do that.
David, thank you again. And for
Okay.
everybody who's here with wonderful questions, really appreciated
Yeah,
it.
thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And I will come back. Thank you. All
Excellent.
right. Good night,
I will see you
everybody.
all. Have a wonderful day. Bye.